know that some of this work is theirs as well. And so my name is Marcus Iannozzi. I'm the founder and principal of Message Agency. We are primarily a Drupal shop, but we're a full-service agency in Philadelphia. And we're a little different, though. We're a B corporation. Who knows what a B Corp is? There's a couple of people. Oh, man. All right. B corporations are for-profits that are certified by an independent nonprofit. They audit your business. It's very rigorous, and they basically certify you as a business that has a social or environmental impact as a fundamental part of what you do. So we only work with nonprofits, universities, foundations, and government. So, you know, a little bit about us. It's one of the reasons we made such a great partner, I think, for this project with Cornell. Because we really like to, whenever there's an internal team at a university, to not just take the whole project, but actually partner with our folks at the university or at the large nonprofit who can take what we do and run with it. So a little bit about what the point of today's topic is. So, you know, a lot of the conversations today, and then in the UX space, often, you know, focus on user needs and business goals and other things like that, but they kind of ignore the technology part. That's not always front and center. And this project is, I think, interesting and germane to a UX conference because experience design is related to technology and data architecture too, and it's not always, again, in the forefront. So this is really about using multiple platforms and sites, how to leverage them to streamline what I'll demonstrate for you soon was a very, very muddled experience for students at Cornell. And it's looking at the role that technical architecture can play in solving UX problems. And it's really about going beyond a single website or platform, and it's looking at an entire ecosystem. So the scale's much bigger. It's more about an enterprise-level solution, and it's also, again, about the notion of the student experience. So it's not just user. It's really about the student. So let's talk a little bit about the problem that they were trying to solve. So the real problem was students couldn't find anything. And this is not my graphic, but I think this is probably pretty close to how awful this scenario was. So my colleague at Cornell describes this as numerous point solutions and a funky garden of websites. So there were all of these platforms that people would access from all these different websites. Students had absolutely no idea what was available to them unless they were in some way directed there. I think it's a problem that a lot of higher ed institutions face, actually. It's a proliferation of technologies, websites, applications. They're created and run independently by different departments and schools and research centers, and it's just a very loose constellation of platforms. And so they also have, a messy array of forms, paths through these various properties, and there's nothing centrally tied to a student profile either. All of these are data silos, in addition to just being, a very confusing way to navigate. The biggest issue is that the students are then missing opportunities and experiences that could have enriched their education at Cornell, and really contributed beyond academics to what they could learn and how they could grow at the institution. And I just wanted to give you guys a sense of the scale and the proliferation here of all these sites and platforms. So they have more than 600 student organizations, more than 1,000 off-campus and community engagement experiences, more than 600 study abroad and exchange programs, and then that doesn't count hundreds of scholarships, fellowship, and funding options that were available to students, and there's more. So again, a real mess. What can sometimes happen at universities is, from the perspective of from a school or an institution, they think about having the student at the center and getting a 360-degree view of the student. what are the programs the student is enrolled in, what are the classes, what major, all of this other data, which is great, and it's great for the institution, but it rarely has an impact on what the student's experience is. And really what needed to happen, and what Cornell realized, is that the scenario needed to be flipped. And the students really needed a 360-degree view of the university from their perspective. There, up until this point, had not been a Start Here button. Again, even if they did have a Cornell, Cornell credentials and a Cornell ID, and if they were lucky enough that there was single sign-on across some of these various platforms, they were still just accessing these things, lots of different doors. So the folks at Cornell had an insight about, how do we flip this equation? And it's a journey that they wanted to start on to develop an enterprise-level solution. So they took a step back and said, what do we have? And, this was, just so you know, the folks who are involved with this, Cornell has an internal, essentially a web development vendor. It's called the Custom Development Team, and it's part of Cornell Information Technologies. It's led by Shannon Osborne. She's the assistant director of that division. And then on the other side, they only do Drupal. And then on the other side, they had Rebecca Joffrey, who was her title, I love her title, IT Innovation Officer. That's a really cool title. And she was heading up the university's implementation of Salesforce. Now, they worked in two different sort of places and two different jurisdictions, but they met each other somehow, and they realized maybe there's a way. We have these two powerful platforms. We know they're very flexible. Maybe there's a way that we can pull them together. Up until this point, though, they were very, very separate. They had a hunch that integrating these two solutions might help solve this problem. They weren't sure how, but they were committed to figuring this out. So what we were able to do is they sort of went out into the marketplace and said, hey, we need experts. We need someone to help us figure this out. And one of the reasons that they tapped into our agency is because we wrote the modules, the Salesforce suite, and they're the Drupal modules that integrate Drupal and Salesforce. And we've been doing these projects for years and years. So they said, look, we don't want a firm to help us develop this. We want a firm to partner with us and help us architect this and understand, first of all, can we leverage this? And if we can, how? How is it going to help us change what the students' experiences are? So we started working with them and talking through what tools were available and some other ways of kind of connecting these. But in general, one of the principles, the design principles we worked with them on was, you have to use each tool in the way that it was designed to be used. You don't use Drupal as a CRM. Drupal's not a great CRM, and you don't try to make Salesforce a CMS. It has some pretty cool, you can do some front end stuff, right? But it's expensive, it's arcane, and there are challenges with that. So use each tool for what it was meant, what it does best, and figure out how to transfer the data. And that's something that we'll talk a little later about the Salesforce suite, but that's something that the suite does very well. It lets you map content types and fields from Drupal across to Salesforce. You can say, hey, we want the data to only move from Drupal to Salesforce, only from Salesforce to Drupal, or in both directions. And and if it's moving in both directions, what are some rules around that? You can also say, is it a synchronous or an asynchronous exchange of data? So is it happening in real time, or is it happening every time cron runs? You can talk about, how does data have to transform from one environment to the other? It gets very deep, but this tool is available that lets you map information across these two platforms, and that in itself was a big step forward for them in thinking through how they might leverage these. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunity. So these are very, very big, there's a big problem. they're also very big platforms, right? Drupal has a big ecosystem. Salesforce has a massive ecosystem. There's a lot of challenges in using both well and then using them together. It's even more tough. So how do you even begin to tackle it? Well, what they realized is that it didn't make sense to try to look at this from a very comprehensive point of view, because there was no way that they were going to be able to solve all the problems or figure out what models would help them solve and streamline the student experience if they started too big. So they started with a pilot project. And specifically, they wanted to start with student study abroad programs. This was a particular problem at Cornell because almost every department had its own study abroad program. There wasn't one entity that managed all of them across the university. Different schools, different departments, all managed their own programs. In addition, there were programs that they would offer to Cornell students that others managed, and there were non-Cornellian students that they would allow to take Cornell study abroad programs. So there's a whole bunch of different actors here. There's, the user base is different. They're both Cornellians and non-Cornellians. Very, very messy. And they thought, okay, let's start with this problem and just solve this one problem and then grow from there. So what they were really looking for here is to find program management tools that better supported students, right? So how do we help students know which programs are good for them, which ones they're eligible for, which ones they've applied to, and what that process is? How do we help them find them in the first place? What's a better way to give them a discovery tool to figure out, of the multitude of experiences that they could pursue, which is right for them? And then analytics to better understand what's going on. So these were really the goals. So this is what they had before. The only place where study abroad programs were aggregated in any way was this awful program called TerraDotta. It still exists because it's outside of Cornell, and lots of universities use TerraDotta to manage its study abroad programs. But this is where non-Cornell programs were posted, Cornell programs were posted, and where both non-Cornellian and Cornellian students would go to see what was available and apply. This was outside of the university entirely. It was very tough to customize. It was very difficult for everyone to use. It was not accessible at all, so there was a challenge, right, with this property to begin with, because it was a university property that was not accessible. And there was also no way to kind of integrate this into any of Cornell's systems. But they did know this had to be a part of the solution in some way, and that was one of the big challenges we had to tackle. So I'm going to just show you a quick video. This is some user research that they did to think through, what is the student experience like right now if they are going to start looking for, the challenges, find study abroad opportunities at Cornell. That was it. It was a very broad task that users were given. So they went to cornell.edu, and then they're like, okay, I'm going to look at the navigation. No, it's not about Cornell. It's not really admissions. I don't see. How about academics? No. Research? No, it's not there. Public? No, not public engagement. Not student life. It was nowhere in the navigation. So they gave up and went to the search bar and just put study abroad in there, right? So you'd think that's where you would go. And, they got some search results, went to the first one. Oh, this is Student Disability Services. Well, it's great that there's actually a page with this content on here, but this isn't really quite what I'm looking for. Okay, I'm going to go to the next link. This is agriculture and life sciences. Okay, well, that's not really what I'm looking for in terms of an experience. I'm kind of scanning this. Okay, this is not what I want. I'm going to kind of go back there. No, this isn't it. I see some programs. And it goes on and on. They go back, and you can imagine this continues. This is one of my favorite parts of this, where they go to this Office of Global Learning, and I go, okay, I can click on that now. I'm here. Okay, education abroad. So they're starting to find things, but we're already a minute and a half into this experience. Really, really frustrating. And some of the things that they heard from one of the quotes from users was, "Right now, Cornell is like a treasure hunt. And most people don't hear about these opportunities until 3 days before the event. And currently, to find things, I have to go to many internal and external sites." So the users were complaining about this experience. Oops. Sorry. Where's my cursor? There it is. So what they ended up designing was experience.cornell.edu. Please go visit it in your free time. But this experience completely redesigned this site completely redesigned the student experience, because this site includes all of the study abroad opportunities across the campus. Students, first of all, have a place to start. This is Start Here. And it's a place they can go to compare programs. They can manage all of their applications to programs. They can start their application process through Drupal. And also, the real, that's pretty straightforward. Yeah, we're going to aggregate all the programs and put it on a website. That sounds great. But what's different about this architecture is that all of the program managers across the school enter their program data here. They do not enter it on their home websites. There's actually a feed from this site that pushes this content to their websites. So it syndicates it to their site. And the reason this is great is they have actually a place to go to come and manage the applications. They can see all the students who apply for their programs as part of this site. So it's a central point of access. There are clear paths. It's also a central point of data entry, and it's a central point of data management for administrators. So just talk a little bit. This is what happens. This is the after. So once this was built, they did another set of student tests. And the student needed to go to experience.cornell.edu. They're like, oh, okay, this was a test site, so they had to refresh it. It clearly identifies opportunities by these categories, so it's leveraging taxonomy. They're like, all right, I want a global, study abroad program. It gives them an option to compare. They can get more info or just directly apply. And I'll show you some screenshots later. While this is Drupal, there are a number of data points here that are being pulled directly from Salesforce. When the program administrators create the programs in Drupal, it creates a record in Salesforce for that program. There's also an entire application engine. I'm going to stop here because this one is pretty long. But there's an application engine that generates that application in Salesforce. And so it starts a whole process and a whole workflow where the data and the information is in one place. So we're going to talk a little bit about the architecture now that's made this possible. Does anybody have any questions before we keep going? Okay. So this is what you saw before. This is what it looked like after. Still complicated, right? It's still complex, but the experience is streamlined. And I think that's really the point that we're trying to make in this case study. You can still have a very complex scenario, but if you're able to streamline that experience and you can integrate platforms and move data around, once you figure out how to do that, you have more control over what the user is able to do. So there were kind of 4 general tasks here that these various platforms delivered. It was either about discovery, as I mentioned before. It was about program management. It was about application creation and submission, and then about data management after the fact. So this is the sort of connection. The arrows are saying basically in which direction the data is going. So, just to make it clear, this is the discovery platform. It's the same as the management platform for directors, but I'm going to show you this, just subtle differences between the two. But that Drupal site is pushing to the college and program websites. They're all connected to the application engine, and that's connected to the CRM. So how does this work? We know that the challenge with a lot of the college and program websites is that they're not all built by Cornell's web development department, right? They're there are tons of different CMSs that were used. Some of them are still flat sites. There's all kinds of technologies. So what was great about using Drupal as that primary point of data entry around a program is that that information could be syndicated and easily pushed to these sites. It's a simple feed. And as long as those sites can consume the feed, and as long as that central web development department in Cornell could help those clients, those internal clients, set that up, it became very powerful. And they're like, oh, okay, we don't have to manage this in two different places. We've got one place to go. And some students will start their journey there. So it was important, not just in terms of data entry, but it was important that that be considered as a point of entry, and that the information be the same, and that also the student could be directly sent to the application from that site. They didn't have to also go to experience.cornell.edu. And again, it was CMS agnostic. So in terms of Drupal and Drupal's role, there's two different ways that Drupal's utilized. It's really primarily the discovery platform for students, and it's also the place they go to see their applications, to start the application process and to see. So in addition to feeds coming from Drupal into the college and program websites, there's also a feed from TerraDotta. And some of the non-Cornellian programs get pulled into Drupal and turned into native Drupal content and commingled with all the other nodes that are created natively in Drupal. And then because they're being pulled into Drupal, they also get created in the CRM. So it's a way of actually getting data in TerraDotta, this terrible platform, into a CRM and having it normalized and available. In addition, when they start this application process here, they go right from an opportunity to the application. There's also data from the application and the CRM that shows up for students, like the status of the application, like if there's something they have to complete or fill out, a deadline. There's real-time updates and data that gets displayed to that end user, and that's all kind of managed in between the application and the CRM. The other thing that's really important about this is this other connection here with PeopleSoft. So Cornell was not going to abandon PeopleSoft. They're also not ready to completely replace all of these point solutions that have been around for a long time. That's a painful and just doing that all at once would be just an impossible process. So instead, because of the flexibility Drupal and Salesforce have, they were able to continue to leverage those point solutions and pull data in. So PeopleSoft is where all of the student data lives. And so PeopleSoft populates contacts in the CRM, in Salesforce, and that means that when a student logs in, they don't have to, and they apply, they don't have to provide any information. They don't have to put their name in, their address in, their social security number in, all of the duplicate data entry they would do on all of those other websites. It's all already available. It's part of their record, and the person reviewing their application sees it with the application. But the student never had to enter that data. So that was also a very important concept. We wanted to think about administrators as end users as well. That's something I think that gets forgotten a lot. And it's something we do just with our sort of content management, our practices around content management and content governance. But it's really, really important when you get to something that's this complicated. And then just to give you a little bit of a zoom in, this is an opportunities list page. So you saw that, a preview of that in the video. But really, the way that this works is all of this data here was getting pushed to Salesforce, so it's synchronized. And I don't think there's any data points on here that are pulled from Salesforce. And then if you look, though, at an opportunity node, you'll see that there are a number of data points here that actually some of these are coming from Salesforce. They weren't entered in Drupal. And then the students have a dashboard. And the dashboard says, okay, here's my favorites. Here's my comparison results table. This was all stored because they can authenticate and bookmark these programs, and then decide which ones they're going to apply to. And I can't really see that up there, but some of these data points are also being pulled in from Salesforce, from the application status. And the student dashboard then also gave them the applications themselves. And it told them, hey, do they want to commit or withdraw? Just clicking that button would change a status in Salesforce. And the program manager would get a notice, and they'd know, okay, the student withdrew, and do whatever sort of back-end management they'd have to do around that. The checklist steps here, this also was a direct feed from Salesforce. Drupal would go to Salesforce and say, what are the steps that have been completed? What are the remaining steps? And then just display this data. So this was both a combination of web services, which would provide that instantaneous information, and data synchronization for the Salesforce suite, because it was trying to do page loads. With this level of data exchange would really put a drag on performance. That's something else with integrations that I think people don't always consider. When there's always a live connection to another system, it could take a long time for those queries to run and for the page to load. If for whatever reason there's a breakdown in communication between the two platforms, the end user's experience is terrible. When you have a data synchronization like this, most of that information is probably going to be up to date. And even if it isn't, the worst thing you'll see is some out of date information. You're not going to have an entire page break because you don't have data to load. So that's another benefit of this type of approach. In terms of the platform management, as I mentioned, they're able, the sort of directors of these programs are able to log into Drupal, create new opportunities. Those create records in the CRM. And then it also, as I said, starts a workflow where they can begin creating an application. The really amazing thing, this is also their dashboard of applicants. This is in Drupal, and this tells them per program, what are all the applications they have to review. And again, some of these data points are being calculated in Salesforce, being pulled directly in. The really fascinating part of this has nothing to do with Drupal at all. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but there's a product in Salesforce called Communities, and it's meant to be, it's like an engagement platform, and it has a number of features built into it. It's really hard to customize. It's kind of a pain, and we don't like it. And our clients have to purchase licenses to let their end users use it. So what we love about Drupal is that we can integrate and exchange this data, and the clients don't have to pay additional licenses to Salesforce for those end users. We kind of get around that. Salesforce is not like that, but we like that, and our clients like that. But it was important in this case. There was a Salesforce consultant who built an entire application engine for them out of Salesforce. And the other problem they had was that every program had a different application and was collecting different data. And so it was almost impossible to try to normalize that experience across all these different programs. So what did they do? They created an application engine in Salesforce. And they had standard fields, and then they allowed the program directors to create custom fields. And this application actually still stored that data in Salesforce. It would create custom fields on Salesforce Records based on the ad hoc fields created here. It's a really brilliant solution. But what was great about it is that students could start here or here, get to the application, complete it. All that data would go into the CRM, and then they would get directed right back to the Drupal site to see what the status of the application was. This is just a preview of what that application looked like. They could have done a better job of making these things, I think, look, sort of the UI kind of, right, making these look a little more similar and not so dissonant. But this was a pretty big project. And then finally, the CRM. This is the place where all of the reporting is done. Folks who are administering, not just sort of the program directors who are marketing the programs, but the folks who are really administering students and all of this information can go, and it's all of that collected in one place. And this is just a quick example of the Salesforce record. So any questions?
Could you go back to the Salesforce record?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of fields. I believe this is the Lightning. So this looks probably a little different from some of you guys. How many people have used Salesforce? Yeah, I mean, the older skin is just awful. And for a while, we didn't even use Lightning because some things are missing from that interface. But they're getting better. Like, things are starting to be more accessible. But it's a little cleaner. So look at it if you can. But it's basically, here's this applicant, here's all their applications, it collects their recommendations, it has all their educational history, and again, this is pulled in from PeopleSoft, and they're able to just manage all of this right from this location. Yes?
So PeopleSoft talk to Salesforce, Salesforce talks to Drupal, Drupal talks to Salesforce, Drupal doesn't talk directly to PeopleSoft.
It does not. No.
Okay.
No.
So
there you go back.
I've worked in a different kind of thing with e-commerce where we had QuickBooks and Salesforce and Drupal. When I was working in D7, we sometimes had issues where, in our case, QuickBooks would glitch out. It was actually the integration built by that developer, but it was not us. But that would sort of glitch out, and then it would cause like almost a feedback loop with us with Drupal. Did you ever have anything like that? Have you had any issues like that with PeopleSoft or anything?
To my knowledge, no. They haven't had that problem.
Okay.
Primarily because users are authenticating, right? So, there's some continuity across all of those records.
Yeah.
I do not know the rate at which the PeopleSoft data that's coming in refreshes. I don't know.
So
there might not be the same kind of race
okay.
conditions. That I couldn't answer. Yes.
This looks great. The opening slide had a bunch of those other student life programs outside of global. Does this story continue?
It does. It does. I'll get there. But that's a great question. So, a little bit just about the underlying technology. I've talked about the suite. I've talked about the fact that there were web services directly written in Salesforce that were, sending information that Drupal would consume and just display. The other part of this that was really, really critical was single sign-on. That's because, right, thinking through a streamlined experience, the last thing we want to do when users are going across all these various platforms is hit these authentication walls. And that's terrible. But this was actually, ironically, the hardest part of the entire project. Lots of reasons, technical reasons I couldn't explain, our developers could explain better than I. But the biggest part of the challenge is there were two different user bases. There were Cornellians and non-Cornellians, and both needed to authenticate. And this created a whole host of problems. But the solution was we did help them, and they their developers did a lot of this research on their own. So we helped a little bit, but they did the majority of that work. And they were able to resolve it. It's a little kludgy right now, but it does work.
What was the solution? I have a project with that same thing where the vendor's pushing back and single sign-on, but it's how we operate at a
That is also, above my skill set, but I can put you in touch with the folks at Cornell, and they can help you out for sure. So again, there's just really there's a lot going on here, but these two platforms and the single sign-on approach is really kind of the glue right in the middle. Yes.
So it's Drupal 8, right?
Yes.
Which branch of the Salesforce suite?
There is only one now, good friend, which is the Drupal 8. There is one.
Drupal.org/project/Salesforce. Yes, no, that's excellent. But there's 8.3 and 8.4.
Oh, I think this is an 8.3. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Well, sorry about that. But there is there's compatibility. Sorry. There is compatibility. The suite was forked in 7, and there were 2 completely different divergent branches, and that is not the case now. We actually got funded to redevelop it for 8. That was because it wouldn't have happened if we did. It was a big, really, really big project, and Aaron Bauman, who's our senior software engineer, was the primary architect of that. I have to give him lots of shout-outs. Any other questions before? Yes.
In designing the database, so I assume you're storing the data in Salesforce, but then there are corresponding forms in Drupal. Was there any?
Well, really right now, Drupal is just displaying data, and it's both a discovery tool and kind of like a management tool. Whenever students are engaged, they're sent to, whenever they're going to engage something, they're sent to this. And that was a very specific choice. Because of this application engine that had already started, that was already being built before we got involved in the project, and so much had been invested in that, that needed to remain a key part of this. I think also the flexibility of that engine, it would have been really hard to build something that could be so ad hoc in Drupal. This thing is just so powerful. But that's why we kind of made this distinction between discovery in this platform, engagement and application in this one, and data management in this one. Does that answer your question? Okay. So a little bit about sort of a PS about design principles, because we started this project with these very explicit ideas and talked to Cornell about what you could use the CMS for versus what you could use the CRM for, and thinking through like process orchestration, that needed to be in the CRM, all the business logic and all the workflows, that's in the CRM, and then there's just one data point that can be pushed to Salesforce or pulled from Drupal. We were trying to say don't reproduce logic and other things in Drupal that already could be used in Salesforce. And then conversely, use the CMS for all of your content. You don't have to store everything about that program and all the content related to that program in Salesforce. You can figure out a separation of concerns and store data in different places, as long as it's very clear, right? Where's the source of truth for this information? This is one of the most important aspects of any integration like this. It's what's canonical. And in this case, it's really Salesforce is canonical. And some of the details like images and PDFs and other things, they're stored in Drupal, but it's considered content. But that's not, it wasn't important to store that in Salesforce, so really just the key program data itself is stored in Salesforce and considered canonical. So what are some of the takeaways that we learned and that they learned that was relevant, I think, to a UX conference like this? So the first one may seem obvious, but when you're talking about something that's this comprehensive, it bears noting, which is focus on solving the most urgent problems. And it seemed to Cornell, at first it was very clear to everyone how big this could get. This is something that this approach could be applied across the university. But before they could do that, they needed to, again, find a pilot, find an incentive that the very disparate set of users would buy into this, because it was going to totally change their process. They were going to have to live in somebody else's system. And so there had to be very clearly defined incentives for them. And also, a little later about user research, the user research didn't just inform design, it created the buy-in, because those users realized, oh wow, this is going to solve so many problems for me. I have a better interface to market my programs. I have one place to go to manage this. And they could see that streamlining this was beneficial. So in conducting research with them and getting them involved, they were able to convince them it was something to move forward with. And they're taking this approach, and as they're rolling out new sort of other pilots in other areas, like resources is one, and a few other, I think they're going to look at calendaring and other things. They're figuring out how to get folks involved. And another thing, this is something that Rebecca Joffrey has said, is to create a horizontal solution, not a vertical one. So she's saying, hey, look, we don't have to solve the application problem, right? We have an application problem, sorry, we don't have an admissions problem. So let's just kind of focus on how can we take the things from admissions, which is in PeopleSoft, and leverage that, and the things that are in TerraDotta and leverage that. And what we're going to do is solve the discovery and application part of that. Another one is, we will never ever say that integrations are not challenging. They are very challenging projects. And the thing that I think is most challenging about them is you have to do a lot of planning and a lot of detail. Like, the details are critical. And it doesn't really lend itself well to agile processes, right? You can't just start like building. You can maybe, start sort of designing things, but you have to have an entire map of data. Here's all the data we have in the CRM. What's all of the corresponding information we've got to map in the CMS? What are we pulling over? We had a massive, massive spreadsheet, and it had every data point, and it had the direction of every data point. What were the input types? Were the input types available in Drupal, or what we wanted to use in Drupal, going to be totally different from the input types in Salesforce? How is that data going to be transformed? What direction is it going to go in? What is the frequency with which it was going to be exchanged? All of that had to be planned out first. And that data is actually what drove the interface in Drupal. It wasn't that we started with the interface and thinking about the experiences. What information is going to be available to us where? And so it's a very different way of thinking about it. And then you can, once you have that established, you can start to have more agile practices in the design and development. But that baseline has got to be done. Another one is about sort of the separation of concerns. It's very, it's good when you have multiple teams, kind of the CMS folks dealing with the CMS stuff, the CRM folks dealing with the CRM stuff, but you have to bring those people together in the design phase. You can't have one accept the product of the other in whatever order you're doing that. They have to collaborate, because there are so many things about each platform. There's so many exigencies and idiosyncrasies, and if you don't in that planning phase and in the design phase understand those, you could really get into trouble later. Some other just sort of details. We talked about user research. The other is not stopping with the website. So this is kind of going a little bit along the lines of what you were saying. Yes, they're adding new content types, and they're bringing new sort of programs and other opportunities. That's why it's called experience.cornell.edu, and the content type is an opportunity, right? So it's all the opportunities available to students that aren't necessarily academic or academic programs. But they're also looking at other platforms. So the experience is not just now about a web-based experience. It's also about appointment setting. So they're going to have a calendaring and appointment setting function. They're going to set up kiosks for checking in at different programs or different locations. That will also be fed into here. And they're also thinking about how this affects email automation. And I think someone earlier I was talking to was mentioning email automation. And how can they think through the experience, again, the student at the center of this, and the student's experience at the center of this, how can they start to look at other platforms and other tools, not just websites? And then finally, administrators or end users too. Really, probably, I think sometimes one of the most important ones. So that's it. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. Any other?
How did the process to actually get through discovery and built it out?
Yeah, they actually, I'll tell you what, they're an amazing team. We started working with them in August, and this was they were early stages of design, but they were able to deliver the first phase of this, I believe, in January. Whoa. It was crazy. It was really crazy. They're just an amazing team, and I think just bringing us on in the, we did some coding for them and helped them with the more sort of sophisticated parts of this, but part of that also was training their team. So we were able to actually share knowledge and help their team now. They totally manage this themselves, and they're extending this completely themselves. But I think we were able to kind of cut through some of the challenges they may have run into, and the delays and the rework because we were able to help them architect it.
Do you have any lessons learned and recommendations for us, especially for some of us who don't have a dedicated team like that internally?
It's
Because you have to bring in a Drupal developer from the outside, a Salesforce
It's
developer from
so
the
it's
outside.
expensive, right? You bring in someone from the outside as a consultant to do a project like this, that's a big budget. Definitely a big budget. The other challenge Cornell ran into was they couldn't find anybody who knew how to do this. Most people are Salesforce consultants, and they want everything to be Salesforce native, or they're Drupal, right? And no, or and maybe they'll understand that, yeah, well, Drupal can do almost everything. Yeah, Salesforce is okay, but they don't know how to connect the two. And we just happen to be the strange unicorn that lived in the middle of this and have been doing this. We've been doing this since, I think, the first version of the suite we wrote in 2007. So we've been doing this a long time, and it's rare. So I think the challenge for folks trying to do this is, if you don't have the internal expertise, it's finding the right experts. There's a lot of folks, I think, who say they know how to integrate these tools, and they don't. And figuring out how to evaluate that, right? A lot of it is challenges. This is what happens with technology projects too, right? When there's something that's this arcane, it's like, how do you figure out, like a job interview, right? How do you figure out the questions to ask to trip that vendor up and to make sure they really know what they're talking about? Because you don't know, right? And I think that's tough. Maybe we'll do a blog post about that someday. But it's definitely past performance, because the one thing about this, because both tools are so open-ended, anything is possible, but you've needed to have past performance to make the mistakes, to learn from them, and then figure out how to do things correctly. It's not the kind of thing that you can just do some research on and figure out, like someone can tell you, here's the recipe. It's just completely open-ended. So that's not, as helpful, but I think they're challenges to consider.
Well, that's why you're here today, because I'm from MIT and I wanted to talk with Salesforce and Drupal integration, because I have a lot of projects like this and I've yet to have a successful experience. And there's no internal support, and it's all been external engagement with a lot of money being spent with a platform that doesn't deliver to the client's expectations.
Yeah. I'm very sorry.
You should write the blueprint and offer this.
There is no blueprint. That's the problem. But there is, the starting. I don't know if you've done a lot of, if the integrations have been custom, or have they leveraged this suite?
A combination, but a lot of them are custom.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of integration. It looks just like that, but more.
Yeah.
A FileMaker, website, a Salesforce.
Yeah. It's not an easy problem to solve, but when you solve it and you do it right, it's really powerful. Like that's, the win is pretty incredible. Yes.
So has this been extended to any other programs at Cornell other than Study Abroad?
They are moving forward. If you look at the site, there's a few other, and I'm not completely up to date, but the resources piece here, I don't know, it's not really that advanced.
In the footer I was checking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're going to start pulling things in. This took so much energy just to get this out the door, and they're going to have to start all over, right, with every sort of new segment or area that they're working with. So, but I think to answer the question, while it only took from, let's say, August to January or February, and then a few other updates after that, so maybe a total of a year to have it in the state it's in. I think they had started working before then and building. I'm sure there was a whole phase of research and relationship building prior to this, just to get to this level.
And how did they find you?
They put an RFP out, and someone sent it to us, and we were like, oh,
Because I do that all the time. I still have
yeah. They were like, oh, we can do that. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? All right, great. Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks so much.